Hi. So Paul Heselton here again. So welcome to another English language A-level video. This one we are looking at CLD writing, and we're going to hone in on your favorite subject, spelling. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do today is that you are going to be doing a spelling test. Yes, so get for yourself a pen and a piece of paper and write down the following spellings. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. Number 1, conscientious, as in she's a very conscientious student. Conscientious. Number 2, maneuver, as in parking between two parked cars is a difficult maneuver. Maneuver. Number 3, unnecessary, as in spelling tests are completely unnecessary. Number 4, weird, as in your shirt is weird. Weird. Number 5, xenophobia. Xenophobia is an irrational dislike of foreigners. Xenophobia. Number 6, pneumonia. Pneumonia is damage to the lungs. Pneumonia. Number 7, chlamydia. Chlamydia is damage to somewhere else. Chlamydia. Number 8, rein, as in the horse rider grasped the rein. Rein. Number 9, accommodation. The city was full of wonderful accommodation. And number 10, knowledgeable. By this time, I expect you to be highly knowledgeable about English language A-level. Okay, 10 tricky spellings. Now, let's go through let me just give you the answers. Here we go. So I wonder how many of those you actually got right. So you might want to pause the video, mark your work. If you got it wrong, write it out 10 times each one. And the important thing at this point then is to think, well, what is tricky about English spelling for young writers to get their heads around? So I want you to come up with a list now of the difficulties that English presents in terms of spelling conventions. Okay. Right, I'm assuming that you've written down 4 or 5 things about English that makes it difficult for youngsters and any of us to spell words in English. Here are some ideas. We have this mismatch, of course, in English between the number of phonemes and the number of graphemes. Now, by this point, you ought to know how many phonemes that there are in RP English, and the answer is 44. So there are 24 consonant sounds, and there are 20 vowel sounds. Some of those vowel sounds are short, some of them are long, some of them are diphthongs. And then of those consonants, we have different sorts of sounds, like plosive sounds, affricate sounds, fricative sounds, etc. So there is a mismatch between the number of phonemes and the number of graphemes, which is, of course, 26, because you all know that there are 26 letters in the alphabet. Okay, so English is a non-phonetic language in many respects, and there are many, many words which one cannot spell simply by sounding out the words, as we were instructed to do by our primary school teacher in the phonics lessons. Okay, next one, variation in vowel spellings of schwa. Now, the schwa is rendered in the IPA as a upside down E, and it's the most common sound in English. It's So if you think of conscientious, for example, that final vowel sound in conscientious is an that's a schwa sound. Now there, we spell it I-O-U, so we do this odd combination of vowel sounds. And if we compare it, let's say, with maneuver, has a maneuver has a at the end, and we do that sound simply with that vowel grapheme. So we have variations in vowel spellings of the schwa from that to that, and plenty more variations. So that makes it tricky. The other difficult area in English on your spelling is, where do you put a single consonant? Where do you put a double consonant? You come into a word like unnecessary, and you come into the C and the S, and you're thinking, is it two C's? Is it one C? Is it two S's? Is it one S? Okay, it's a difficult issue. The general rule is that you put a double consonant after a short vowel, and you put a single consonant after a long vowel. So the example I tend to give is the word sitting. Sitting has two T's because it comes after a short vowel, whereas sighting, as in the sighting of a caravan, that's a long vowel, the I sound, and therefore it's a single consonant. So that's the general rule, but of course, English being English, there are lots of variations to that rule. So that's a difficulty, where to put a single or a double consonant. Now, the other thing about English, of course, is that we have nicked not only the words, but also some of the spelling patterns from other languages. Take, for example, xenophobia, right? Now, hands up, how many of you spell that with a Z at the front? Okay, so you're not admitting it, eh? So the reason why we put an X at the beginning of that is that because in the ancient Greek, it was spelt with an X. So a lot of words, the spelling that we have, it's not a good rule to sound it out and think how it sounds. It's much better to think, well, where did this word come from in the first place? What is its etymological root? And that gives you more of a clue as to the patterns in the spelling. Okay, what else? We have, of course, lots of spellings with silent letters in English. Take, for example, that one. Pneumonia, so that we don't obviously pronounce the P in there. Now, you might be forgiven for thinking, well, once upon a time we must have pronounced the P in there. In fact, not so. It so happened that when academics and scholars were writing in the 16th, 17th century, they decided it would be a good idea to put a nod to the etymological roots of the words in order to show where the word had come from. So in this case, from ancient Greek. So in fact, in English, that P has never been sounded on a word like pneumonia. It's just been added in. And the same could be said for words like island, for example. So island has never been pronounced in English island like that. It's just that we've taken it from Latin, and the Latin word is insula. So when people were writing it down, particularly in the early Renaissance period, they wanted to signal that this came from ancient Latin, and therefore it gave it a kind of status and prestige. So we have the difficulties of spellings with silent letters. I should also add, of course, that pronunciation has changed over time. So if you take knight, as in a knight in shining armour, if you were riding around in the 14th century, that would have been pronounced knicht, like that. And so what's happened is that the spelling there has fossilized and the pronunciation has changed over the centuries. So there's some quite interesting language change concepts that are hanging around here, and we'll come on to those in the next part of the course on language change. So then we have spelling rules, okay, and we've talked about those before in a previous video, which may or may not apply. So you've got, I before E except after C, and you think, well, that's a good rule for all children to remember. And then you come across a word like that, where, it doesn't seem to be following the rule. So there are spelling rules to follow, but often there are anomalies to those rules. The other thing to think about is regional variation in pronunciation, because if children are being asked, as I said before, to phonically sound out phonemes, then the way that a child spells down in London is going to be different to the way that a child spells up in Newcastle, because obviously their phonemes are going to be different, and particularly the vowel sounds are going to be different. So there's that regional variation in pronunciation. And then we have homophones, of course. So we have words that sound the same, but with different meanings and different spellings. So whether and whether, there and there, to and to. All of the spellings of these all depend upon context. So even if we're typing these out, it's not going to help us. We're not going to get a squiggly red line underneath it if we've simply done the different homophone spelling. Even technology, great though it is, it hasn't gone so far as to be able to solve that problem. So those are some of the main issues that words raise when it comes to spelling them. So here's, and you'll find this in the booklet where I've actually put 5 of these chunks of writing, but I've got here 3 chunks of children's writing. And what you need to do is have a close look at them simply in terms of their orthography, which is a posh word for spelling, and to rank them from the most basic to the most sophisticated. Here's one. There's another. And there's another. So it would be a good idea for you to, if you haven't got those texts in front of you in the booklet, for you to pause the video and try and rank them, which is the most sophisticated in terms of using orthography, which is the most basic. Okay, now I'm not going to do a thorough analysis of that because what I want to show you is some theory on this, which will then enable you to do close analysis on texts like this. So let's go into Richard Gentry's stages. Now, of course, we love our stages in CLD. We've had so many of them, haven't we? And the big one on CLD so far has been Kroll, Barry Kroll's 4 stages in children's writing development, which, of course, you've memorized. Yes. So preparatory, let's get this right, consolidation, differentiation, and integration. So they're very useful because they are holistic. They're looking at the children's writing as a whole in terms of, yes, the spelling, but also the lexis and the grammar and the discourse and the graphology and everything. Okay, so Kroll's very, very important for you to be applying. Gentry is also important, but Gentry is only about the spelling. Okay, and he comes up with 5 different stages in children's spelling. The first stage he calls the pre-communicative stage, and this is round about 3 or 4 years old. And this is obviously the earliest stage where children are just about learning about literacy, and they're beginning to understand that symbols on the page mean something. Now, if they're doing this before they go into school, you probably call this emergent literacy. They haven't yet learned to write properly, i.e. in a structured way in infant school, but they are highly motivated, they're keen to try and communicate. And at this stage, there may be a lot of time and effort that's going in to bits of writing, which may not mean anything to anybody who's not sitting next to the child. And so the child can't explain, the child isn't there to explain what the symbols mean. There may be lots of invented symbols representing what the child thinks of as words, but there's probably no knowledge of how the letters represent sounds, or indeed which direction to use letters or words. So directionality might be all over the place, not only on the line, but also in terms of the letters within individual words. There's probably not even a sense of an individual word at this point. What you're going to get is a mixture of numbers, letters. Some of them are going to be uppercase, some lowercase. If there are any coherent spellings here, it's probably going to be the letters of the child's own name, especially its first letter. So it's going to look something like this. Now, good luck in deciphering that. It's very, very difficult to identify individual words here, and therefore, spelling. It's difficult to understand anything that's going on here. We have, E's and O's perhaps, and F's and H's and things like that. But this is very, very characteristic of Gentry's pre-communicative stage. Lots of time and effort's gone into it, directionality, delineation, but in terms of demarcation of words and indeed linkage of letters and words to meanings, nothing going on there yet. Let's go into the second stage. This is the semiphonetic stage. This usually starts around 4 years old and goes through kind of until the end of infant stage. Now, at this stage, writers are beginning to understand that each individual letter has a sound, and they're beginning to learn about letter formation and this linkage in English between phonemes and graphemes, because they're obviously learning this at school through phonics. What's characteristic at this stage is that you often get abbreviation of words in various ways. So sometimes, let's say the child is trying to spell the word dog, it may be just a D. So it might be just the initial letter that the child puts. At other times, they what's called telescope the word. So could, for example, is spelled as k, d, C and a D. So the initial letter and the terminal letter, that's all there is. That's called telescoping. And sometimes the child might use letter names in quite complex ways. Say DRT for dirty, which kind of makes logical sense, doesn't it? Dirty, because when we sound out T, we often say T. So, as always, make the point that, there is a kind of rational logic behind a lot of the ways that children are trying to work out some of the orthographical patterns of English. They're beginning to understand directionality, though you probably get lots of reversal, graphemic reversal at this stage, where B's and D's, for example, are turned around, or even words can be reversed too. What does it look like? Here is a child who has written, I am playing soccer. Can't you see? So there it is, IMPSCR. They're probably a very keen text messenger. I am playing soccer. So this is a fantastic example of telescoping, isn't it? Where you've got the reduction of the complications of the spelling just to the key kind of sounds. I am playing soccer. So this is very characteristic of Gentry's semiphonetic stage, probably the earliest part of Gentry's semiphonetic stage. Let's move through to the next stage. This is, logically enough, the phonetic stage. So this, and notice on the year how old the children are here, there's some, I was going to say contamination there. There's some mixture between them. These are very, very rough years. So obviously at this stage, as it says on the tin, spelling tends to mirror sound. So writers here are sounding out everything that they spell. So what you're going to get are some logical patterns, but it may not be standard English. Certainly the writing is easier for the reader to interpret because you've got your word spacing, so you can actually see what an individual word is. And the words are tending to go in the right direction. So at this stage, you're getting a developing good link between graphemes and phonemes, certainly more developed than you had in the semiphonetic stage. This stage, it can cover quite a long period of development. Children who are becoming literate fairly quickly, they can be in this phonetic stage at the age of 5. On the other hand, you might have writers who show residual traces of this phonetic spelling for a long, long time, perhaps even going into secondary school. So what you want to do on this one is look particularly at how children deal with new and difficult words to see if they're beginning to follow the standard patterns of spelling. What about this one then? So we've got this delightful picture, which you can only partially see because I'm masking it there, but here are two people and they're in the garden and these are the flowers. And so here's a piece of phonetic stage orthography that says, I am picking flowers. So we have standard English form of the first person singular subject pronoun I. We have the primary auxiliary verb am, spelt perfectly in standard English. We have picking. Okay, so we have a decent rendition of picking. Obviously, we would be struggling if we didn't have the image right next to us here, but because it's dialectical, we have an image there that helps us. And we have, well, what have we got? We've got a consonant cluster has been reduced. And often on this, it's useful to talk in terms of phonological terms that we learnt on CLD or from, children's speech. So here, picking, that's the velar nasal phoneme in standard English, picking like that, and that's been reduced to picking like that. So the difficulty that children have, of course, is listening very carefully to vowels and being able to differentiate between picking, for example, that second vowel, that's the schwa sound. But it so happens to be spelt with an I when we're using the progressive aspect of the verb. And then flowers, again, we've got a reduction here. We've got a reduction of a consonant cluster. Fl is not necessarily so easy for a 5-year-old to say. So it's been reduced. So flowers like that. And when we say it, when adults say it, how many of us actually sound out in a very clear way the W phoneme? Answer, not very many. So, this is phonetic spelling. And, the child should be credited for trying to sound out the sounds of these words. Okay, and as we said before, a child's regional accent actually may play a big part in the way that they've spelt the words. Move on, they said, to stage 4. This is the transitional stage, and this usually begins at 6 or 7. It can extend into adult life, and this is where the writer is beginning to follow some of those accepted patterns that you'd find in English spelling, and they've got this increasing repertoire of spelling words in a correct way, I should say a standard way. So in every syllable, just like in standard English, vowels are used in some form. And the writer's making a good attempt to recall words and to spell new words. And it's, there are various strategies that the child is using to sound out the spelling. We've seen this text before, I think, when we were looking at Kroll, but it's a good one to use. Hear the child say, I'm going to Florida, or we might go to the beach, and I can swim. So we've got about 50 to 60% of these words here are spelt in a standard way. If you look at the last three words, for example, okay, the simple words, they're monosyllables, but they're all spelt in a standard way. We have an omission of a bit of punctuation here because the apostrophe of omission has been deleted. I'm going to Florida, and we've got this inversion going on, graphemic inversion, where the G looks slightly odd because it's back to front. But that apart, though, the lettering idiosyncrasies apart, it's actually a good spelling of going. It's standard spelling of going. We have some omission going on in the medial position of this proper noun Florida. And we might go to the word that's spelt in a non-standard way there is might. Perhaps this is evidence of the child understanding about the magic E. This is the E marker rule, where long vowels are usually followed by an E at the end of the word. So bid becomes, and that's not a good example, mad becomes made by putting an E on the end, or bit becomes bite by putting an E on the end. And so logically enough, the child might be thinking might, ooh, that sounds like a long vowel. I think I'm going to shove an E on the end of there. So it is non-standard, but you could argue that there is a kind of logic that's going on there. Okay, so although it's a fairly basic piece of writing, Gentry would argue, I think, that this is probably in the transitional stage. And then, hallelujah, we reached the correct stage. Now, the correct stage doesn't mean every single word is necessarily spelled in a standard way, but what we've got at this stage is a good knowledge of the English spelling system and word structure. And this is a child who is able to use prefixes and suffixes in logical ways. So, if they're coming across a word and it's got un on the front, then they're going to know how to spell that. Or if they're forming an adverb, quickly, for example, they're going to know that ly is that adverbial suffix. Okay, so knowledge about prefixes and suffixes, and also the ability to distinguish homophones. So these are these words that sound the same but are spelt differently, like weather and weather, and increasing accuracy in the use of things like single and double consonants. And at this stage, the child is using analogy. So they've noticed patterns going on in other words, and so what they do is they sort of move that pattern onto a new word which they're coming across. So, for example, C is spelt with double E's. So the writer uses the double E sound, or rather double E letters, in the word deceit. So it's non-standard, but there is a logic that's going on there because the child is creatively using analogy in a kind of nativist way. Okay, so what does it look like? Looks like this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a very sophisticated long piece of writing. All that we're looking at is the spelling. I couldn't wait to eat tacos. I tell you what, I can't wait to eat tacos as well. A bit of Mexican food. And look at this. It's all actually written in standard English. So you've got the modal auxiliary, the epistemic modal auxiliary verb there, could, C-O-U-L-D, that's spelt in a perfect standard way with that digraph. It's a single phoneme, the U, but it's rendered with a digraph, i.e. a combination of two letters, O-U there. Again, it's got apostrophe of omission in the right place. Again, a digraph there is used for that long vowel in wait and to eat tacos. And there we've got a word which is Spanish in origin. So maybe the child has never spelt that word or come across that word before, but they've sounded it out. And they've managed to strike gold by spelling it in a standard way. Okay, so what I'm suggesting to you is that when you are looking at orthography in children's writing, then Richard Gentry is a good place to go. It's a good model to follow. And here is Gentry's so-called monster test. This is good, this. I like this. So children were asked to spell these 10 different words at different ages. And what it demonstrates is the development of children's spelling over time. So you take, for example, united. So in the pre-communicative stage, then a child trying to spell the word united is just going to be doing random letters. It could be upper and lower case, it could be numbers. It's going to be all over the shop. At the semiphonetic stage, the child might be just doing that thing where they just abbreviate, where they just, it's the first letter and they just write U. Once they get into the phonetic stage, then that's a pretty good rendition of the word. All that is missing is the E grapheme in the past tense form of it, united. So there's your phonetic stage where the child has sounded it out. Look what happens in the transitional stage. It's like the child is going crazy. And at this point, of course, the parents come on board and they might be very concerned. They think, my Charlie, he was spelling united in a beautiful way only 6 months ago, and he went off to that horrible school, and look what he's doing now. Well, the parents should be celebrating there, because what this shows is this child is trying to use analogy. They've thought of the way that other words are spelled. They're seeing patterns and they're trying to apply those patterns. Now, of course, the child has done this in a non-standard way, but they ought to be congratulated for their creativity. It's a stage, right? And then finally, you've got the conventional stage there of united. So these are really interesting. All these 10 words, it demonstrates on this table how Gentry's stages might work. There are alternatives. There are other spelling stages available to you. There is Kathy Barclay's stages, 1996, where she talks about the 7 stages that child develop in their writing skills. Now, she talks about these as if it's a general writing skills, but actually she's focused pretty exclusively on spelling. So she talks about stage 1, the scribbling stage, and then stage 2, mock handwriting stage, and then stage 3, mock letters. So all of those sorts of features, you could argue, are kind of emergent writing, the sorts of things that children are doing independently before they set foot into school. And then you've got conventional letters, where usually involves writing the name of the child, putting letters on a stage. And then you've got what she calls the invented spelling stage, where the child spells in a way that they understood that the word should be spelt, which I suppose correlates to Gentry's semiphonetic and phonetic stage of spelling. And then you've got stages 6 and 7, appropriate phonetic spelling stage, and then correct spelling stage, which I think kind of relate to stages 4 and 5. Okay, so Kathy Barclay is an alternative theorist for you to reference in your essays. Okay, let's move on if we can. Okay, so let's think about terms that we could be using for discussing spelling. Problem here with the mouse. Okay, let's go back. Let's see if we can do this. Technical hitch here. Done that. Right, here we go. So here we have got the kind of typical features that you would expect to see, the non-standard spellings you'd expect to see in children's writing. And there are 7 of them here. So phonetic spelling, words are spelt how they sound. You've got under and overgeneralization. So undergeneralization would be where your standard rules for particular spelling patterns are not being followed. So, for example, a child might be spelling parties just as P-A-R-T-Y-S. So they're not following that rule that when you pluralize something, then you're going to change the Y consonant to I-E-S. So we're going to call that undergeneralization. And the opposite of that is overgeneralization. This is where regular spelling rules are applied even when it's not accurate to do so. Dare one even say the noun phrase virtuous error here? Okay, like rund. So we've got omission, where letters are missed out, particularly where double consonants appear. We have insertion, where you've got the addition of extra letters that are not needed in standard English. We have substitution. A lot of these are exactly the same as when you were learning about phonology, CLD phonology. So substitution, where the right letter is replaced with an alternative. And then finally, you've got transposition, where a pair of letters is switched around. So, for example, O-L-N-Y instead of only. Okay, so they are to learn. Also here, just a reminder about the terms that you should be using. So don't call them letters, call them graphemes. Don't call them sounds, call them phonemes. And this word digraph for a cluster of 2 or more letters representing a single phoneme, like, for example, TH. Also useful to remember these phonological terms as well. So we've got homophones. So these are words that are pronounced the same but have different meanings and different spellings. So you're there and there, they're homophones. We have homonyms. So homonyms are words that are spelt and pronounced the same but have different meanings. So Pole, as in a person from Poland, and Pole, homonyms. And then we've got heterophones, so words that are spelt the same but are pronounced differently and have different meanings. So tear and tear, or read and read, or invalid or invalid. That was a good one, wasn't it? Okay, so homophones, homonyms, and heterophones, they are occasionally useful for you to be using. Okay, so this was from an old AQA textbook, actually, this exercise. What you've got on the left-hand side is the child spelling, and on the right-hand side, you've got the target word that they're trying to spell. So what would I encourage you to do is I would go down that list and make a note of what patterns that you are noticing there. So, for example, on the first one, child is trying to write in standard English suddenly, but they've done suddenly, S-U-D-D-N-L-Y. What you would point out is that the child has got it mostly standard because the child has got a double consonant in the middle there, 2 Ds, which is kind of logical because the is a short vowel. So it's not just a question of pointing out what's wrong, in inverted commas, about the spelling, but also noticing what the child has managed to achieve. They've also got the suffix on the end done in a standard way. So because it's an adverb, It's a suffix there, ly on the end. But of course, what makes it non-standard is omission. So it's that schwa sound in the middle of the word, that vowel sound, which in standard English is rendered with an E. So what you want to do is you want to go down the rest of those and in a lot of detail try and use these terms talking about what is non-standard about the spelling, but also maybe trying to get into the mindset of the child, thinking, well, why have they spelt it in that way? And what have they done in that is correct about some parts of the word? So I'll leave that in your safe hands. Finally, we're going on to Michael. So let's now have a look at a bit of extended text. And you're in the exam. Let's say this is your piece of data to look at. Let's say you've got some kind of contentious statement that says, well, spelling is the most important element of children's language, children's writing, I should say. Spelling is the most important aspect of children's writing. And then you're given a bit of text, okay? So this is what it might look like. Memories, and this is written by a 9-year-old who comes from Barnsley, apparently. A long time ago, when I was 6 years old, me and Neil went out mischiefing. I chucked a stone and it nearly hit a window. Then we ran off. Then we came to somebody's garden. Then we climbed up their tree and shouted, "Fathead." Then we climbed and ran off home, and then we went back mischiefing again. We came to a boy and shoved him down in the grass and pinched his sweet. And then we ran off, and then I made an apple bun, and then I chucked it, and then we went home. Charming. Right, so he's 9 years old, and he's remembering something from 3 years before. There's all sorts of interesting things that you could say about this. But we're just focusing for the time being on the orthography, on the spelling. What about these bits in red, for example? Me and Neil went out mischiefing. Well, that's not an easy word to spell, is it? It's an unusual polysyllabic, progressive aspect, ing, progressive aspect, material verb. So use your AO1 terms in describing what you see. Now, what's non-standard about it? Well, Michael is undergeneralizing the MIS prefix, adding an E grapheme, because in most words, when we go misunderstand, for example, it's just the MIS is the prefix. So Michael here has added an E on there. So we've got undergeneralization of a rule about the prefix, the MIS prefix. And what else has he done? He's reduced the, in standard English, IE digraph to a single I vowel. Now that's perfectly understandable, isn't it? Because this is not necessarily a word that you're going to come across every day. So it's an unusual word. So it's an omission that we've got there. So notice here how I'm trying to use AO1's terms in a really precise way. And when I'm writing about the letters individually, I'm putting these weird looking brackets in. That's to show it's the letter rather than the sound that I'm talking about. Then we've got chucked, right? CHUT. Now there's another interesting spelling that we've got. So it's a phonetic spelling. So what Michael here is doing, he's undergeneralizing the ED past tense inflection. He's talking about something in the past tense, and he's not applied this rule that you put usually in standard English. You put ED on the end of a verb in order to denote it's the past tense. And instead, he's substituted with a T. So it's a plosive. This is where you can show off your phonological knowledge. Plosive alveolar phoneme T. Okay, so if I'm looking at are these the only two spellings that I've looked at so far? These seem to have the hallmarks of the kind of phonetic stage, but obviously I would need to go through the whole of the passage and pick out, let's say, 8 other spellings in there. And what we're trying to identify, I suppose, is patterns. So rather than just building a whole essay around just me pointing out those 2 non-standard spellings, you want to see the patterns that are going across. So if, for example, omission is a pattern where, in standard English, it's a consonant cluster and it's been reduced, That's the sort of thing that you want to be honing in on, and you want to be linking as much as possible to Richard Gentry's spelling stages, and possibly even Kathy Barclay's stages as well. Okay, so this is in the booklet. I will leave this in your hands. It would be a good idea for you now to try and continue that process of what I've done there. And finally on this, this is the sort of thing that you get in the exam. So you get your contentious statement like that. Spelling is the most important aspect of children's language development. And like all of these things, what they want you to say is yes, but because you're going to be saying, well, orthography is clearly important because you're not going to be able to, as a reader, understand what is written unless the orthography is there in standard English. Okay, so spelling is clearly important, but of course there are other language levels which you might argue are equally important, if not more important. So the question is going to be worded like that: with reference to the data and your own knowledge from language study, evaluate this view of children's language development. So make sure that your opening paragraph kind of deconstructs the semantics of the quotation. For example, it might say, oh, look at this spelling is. That's a very dogmatic use of the verb there. It's the copular verb that's being used. So it gives the sense of great certainty. And the sensible thing to say is, well, it depends on the data that you're looking at, and it depends on the context of the piece of writing. The other sensible thing to say is there are lots of really important language levels in English, and spelling, being graphology, is one of them. But what about shout out to punctuation? Or how about semantics and lexis, actually vocabulary that's being used? What about the ability of the child to use grammar so that the child can form syntax and use the morphological endings of English, etc., etc.? So in your opening paragraph, you want to show that, yes, whilst there is some rationale to that statement, obviously it can be argued. So deconstruct the semantics of the quotation in your first paragraph, and then get stuck into your data. So look at some of the standard and non-standard spelling features that you're seeing in the text, linking it to AO2 theory. But do make sure when you're writing about the data that it's embedded within your paragraphs, and that you have topic sentences which keep answering the question, rather than it turning into simply a commentary on the text in front of you. Do present the counter argument, which argues the importance of other language levels, and again, link that in with AO2 theory. So, for example, you might be bringing in Vygotsky, for example, and his zone of proximal development. And don't just stop at the end exhausted. You need some kind of balanced conclusion where you weigh up finally whether you think it is actually true to say that spelling is the most important aspect of children's language development. Okay, so I will leave that in your capable hands, and that is all that I want to say about children's spelling for the time being. So thanks very much. I hope that was useful for you.